Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the great pleasure of Jimmy Burroughes on the show. Good afternoon and good morning to you, Jimmy.
Hey, Julian. Good to see you. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation, and only yesterday I was on your show, and so that's great and good to connect with you. Good to get to know you a bit better as well. You are the owner and founder of Jimmy Burroughes Leadership, which is all about supporting leaders to transform their businesses' results without working any harder through building a culture of trust, connection, and performance with their teams. You're also the author of Beat Burnout, Ignite Performance, which may be a clue to what we might be talking about today. And you're also the host of the Ways of Working podcast. And we will be exploring beating burnout and igniting performance. Before we get into that, Jimmy, I really want to understand, what do you love about what you do?
It's such an interesting question. What do I love about what I do? Because I'm, as you probably already picked up, I'm quite a passionate person. I kind of go boots and all into everything. And I think the thing I love about what I do it doesn't even feel like work, but what I do for a job is I'm helping people solve a problem that they're really struggling to solve themselves. And potentially they've tried to solve lots of times. Maybe they've worked with other people to try and solve, but it's a problem that's getting in the way of them having a fantastic life. So it could be affecting their personal life, could be affecting their professional life, could be affecting their mental health. And nobody should have to go through that. So what I love about what I do is that I get to bring some of the battle scars and experiences that I've built up, and also some of the academic and research experience that I've built up. And I get to turn that into something that actually makes a difference for people's lives. And I think we're all wanting to make a difference, but I love what I do because I get to make a difference and help people solve problems they can't solve.
Yes, and you are very passionate about it, and I love engaging with you because you do ooze this enthusiasm and ideas of trying to go for it. And so, what was the moment you realised that is what you love and that's what you want to do? And that's my mission in life, is to help those people in this way.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. How do you end up knowing what your purpose is? And I think we spoke about this yesterday, but when we work with teams and leaders in organizations, it's kind of not surprising to me anymore, but it was initially quite surprising how little time people spend thinking deeply about their purpose. And I remember when I was, a young man out, sort of first couple of jobs out of university, and then gradually working my way up through the hierarchy of organizations. I always thought my purpose was to make a difference somehow, but I thought it was through leading. And so I was an army officer, and I got to spend time leading soldiers on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I was in the sort of the corporate world, and I got to lead teams and run businesses and run business units and various other things, run P&Ls. But it never quite felt like I'd hit the groove or hit the magic spot of why was I on this planet. And it was really after 2017 when I started this business that I suddenly felt like I'd found my ikigai, my magic spot to really be on purpose. And part of that, I think, is coming from the helping people. I very much like to help people, but it's almost like I can help people to see a way through a really challenging situation that makes their lives better. And that, to me, is the purpose of what we do, is actually talking people off the ledge of burnout, where they're thinking, do you know what, maybe I'm going to have to quit this job. Maybe I'm close to a nervous breakdown. I'm really struggling mentally. My relationships are failing. I feel like I'm sort of wading through mental treacle, and to get them back to the point where, like, actually life's pretty good again, and my team is functioning, and my relationships are back on track, and I'm feeling good about life. And that, to me, is the difference that I can now make, that makes everything we do worthwhile.
Interesting phrase, talking people off the ledge of burnout. Now, you had the experience of burnout, hence that's what you're passionate about. And I'd love you to explain a little bit more about what you perceive as what burnout is, what your definition of burnout is, because we all have different definitions, but I'd like to understand from your perspective. But I also like to understand how it affected you, and what was the impact on you, and how did it impact your performance And yeah, I think that's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those stories I tell quite frequently because I think it sets the scene for why we ended up doing this and why we ended up running this business. But essentially, if we rewind the clock back to 2017, I was a GM running a team of about 45 people operating in 26 different countries in a large organization, one of the largest organizations of its kind in New Zealand. And in the space of 12 months joining that role, I was the youngest GM in the senior leadership team by about 10 to 15 years. So I'd kind of pushed myself hard to get there through a series of performance anxiety and imposter syndrome moments that often come up. When I joined the team, I was told this team's not really performing. You need to restructure it and get it firing on all cylinders. So there was immediately this kind of high expectations dropped onto me. And then within about 6 months, the organization as a whole went through some pretty significant transformations, changing their asset footprint in terms of buildings and construction and the way they did all of that, changing the way they acquired customers, changing the way they manage customers through the customer life cycle. And there was a lot of pressure in terms of quite a dysfunctional executive as well, where there was lots of disagreements. I had 3 bosses in 18 months. And every time you get a new boss, you obviously have to prove yourself. And then I think the clincher came when there was a legislative change within New Zealand that meant that about 50% of my bottom line just disappeared overnight. And I remember being called into the CEO's office and he said, well, Jimmy, you're part of the business, is the cash cow for this business. You need to find that $20 million. And to me, that was like, oh, okay, even more expectation. At the same time, I was doing an MBA. At the same time, I was traveling sort of 10 days out of 14, living out of hotels, in hosted dinners and hosted lunches. And over time, I could just feel myself getting a bit tireder. And so I would start the day with some caffeine to wake me up and perk me up, maybe a couple of bowls of Coke Zero or lots of teas and coffees, and fuel myself on Snickers bars and Mars bars through the day, have a quick lunch on the fly between meetings. And by the end of the day, I'd come home at sort of 7 p.m., start my work because you've been in meetings all day, run through till 1 or 2 in the morning. And then because you've been buzzing all day, have a couple of glasses, which turn into a couple of bottles of wine over at those few years to just, take the edge off. And then you wake up in the morning and you've got a headache and you're tired. So you have some more caffeine and maybe some Nurofen to get going again. And I just suddenly woke up one morning and thought, I don't know if I've got it in me to go to work today. I'm done. And I kind of started thinking about what was going on in my world. And I was thinking, God, I don't really see the point of all of this. It seems super difficult. And I'm not sure that everything I'm doing is really making a difference, because every time I try something, the rug's just pulled out from under me for whatever reason. It was very, very challenging to get any traction because of the way the circumstances I've described. There seem to be more bad than good days. So, you go to work, you take 1 step forward, you go to work the next day and you'd be 2 steps backwards. And then you'd be trying to open cans of worms, which seem to be filled with more cans of worms. And everything I touched, everything I touched seemed to be really broken and had been sort of held together with masking tape for a number of years. So there was an infrastructural issue that was going to cause some challenges. Over that period of time, as I say, I mentioned my boss changed 3 times, but also that team of GMs around me was starting to leave, have health problems, become disengaged. And so that network that I really relied on was falling away. So I found myself becoming increasingly kind of alone and the only GM left in many of the meetings where there used to be 3 or 4 of us to have a discussion. It was just me. And then obviously, because you're the senior person in the room, the expectation was on you. Then it was you need to find this, $20 million, but don't do anything too risky because we're changing everything else right now. So we need to be quite safe about what we're doing. So don't try anything too innovative, but you need to magically come up with something. And I found myself also going nearly 2.5 years without actually taking a day off. So even when I went back to the UK on leave, I worked every day through the night. And then was with my family during the day. So it's just this relentless pace. And so as you can imagine, over time, that just started to take its toll a little bit. And so in 2017, I just say I woke up that morning and I was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I went in and I resigned and held on for the 3-month notice period by fingernails. But got to I remember getting to the last day and giving the leaving speech and just going home, floods of tears, and was basically broken for 6 weeks. Just couldn't get out of bed, couldn't function, couldn't think. It was like sort of wading through mental treacle to try and make a decision or to do anything. Unfortunately, I also lost a relationship at that point, so I had to move out of home. Had to sell everything that we owned. And it was a very, very challenging period of my life to really understand, even to try and get my head around what was going on, because I didn't have the mental acuity to deal with it. And that was when I know there's a difference between sort of tired out, worn out, and burned out. Because when you're burned out, you're like, oh, it just is what it is. And I don't care. And I don't have the energy to deal with this right now. I just can't. So I just slept for 6 weeks, basically.
I'm sure a lot of people who've experienced that or are actually right now experiencing that are identifying with what you just shared there. When you were going through all that, various pressures and expectations that were put on you, was there any point along that way that you felt sort of signals that your body or your mind was saying, this is not good, this is not great? Was there anything flagging to you along the way, or were you just putting that down to, I'm just a bit tired, I just need to keep going? So what kept you pushing on? What was the driver to keep going, despite your potentially, impacting your health?
And look, it definitely was impacting my health. I was 25 kilos heavier than I am now. I was drinking excessively. I wasn't sleeping. I was living on less than 4 hours sleep a night at that point. I was a walking time bomb, waiting to have a heart attack, probably. And that was where I think I would have ended up if I'd have kept on going at that sort of pace and intensity. And I think the coping mechanisms that I put into place were fairly standard. We tend to, when we get into these situations, the first thing that tends to go is sports and hobbies and exercise. The next thing that tends to go is relationships. We just lock down and we just focus on the work. And then we often find substance abuse or excessive drinking or reliance on stimulants creeping in as well to kind of manage us through the day, or helping us manage through the day. And we know from the research that essentially it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. But at the time, that coffee is going to get you going in the morning, and that beer or that vodka or whatever it is going to slow you down in the evening. And also I've noticed from research, with certainly working with Americans now, uppers and downers, so actually stimulant tablets, drugs, using things like Adderall to get going in the morning, and then using Ambien to go to sleep at night. That's very common in a number of circumstances now. So I think what did I know? Why did I keep going? It was down to sheer bloody mindedness. It was down to performance anxiety. If I give up, if I stop, then I go back to almost the first or second day on the job, and the CEO saying, you're from outside the industry, you're 10 years younger than anybody else around this table. We took a real risk on you. You need to make it work. And that to me was like carved into my mind of, I have to make it work. So I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think also being ex-military, there's a mindset of you can never give up, because if you give up, soldiers will die. So there's always that relentless drive and push and desire to keep going, even at the expense of yourself. And obviously with maturity now, 6-7 years on, I've realized that maybe wasn't super helpful. And maybe I was actually in a sunk cost fallacy situation where I should probably have left that job a year before I did, because there was no way that I was going to turn that oil tanker around with the trajectory that it was sailing on. But at the time I was like, well, I can do this. I've done this many times in my career. I can do this another time. But unfortunately, this time around, it didn't work.
And it's interesting. I got a fact. This is from Westfield Health. This is in the UK, actually. And it says that close to half, it says 46% of the UK workers are close to burnout, which is quite a worrying stat, if that's to be true. People feeling, and it's probably based on how people feel. And then that's how you feel. If you feel that close, that's 1 in 2 people feel close to burnout. And I think, post-pandemic, I think that's probably risen because of the nature of how things are and all the sort of economic sort of drivers that have been going on and putting pressure on people. Like you had that pressure and expectations, and when you get into leadership, you get more expectations and all that. And so what role do you think, and we'll talk a bit more about some lessons learned in a moment from your personal point of view, but what role do you think from a leadership point of view and from an organizational point of view is a responsibility of an organization to help facilitate the sort of staff not to get to a place of burnout, and what can they do to help mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And people mention COVID as like this threshold moment of, well, since COVID, burnout's become a real thing. I think before COVID, it was a real thing. We didn't talk about it as much, but leadership and organizational leadership has been fairly dysfunctional for many, many years, relying on outdated leadership models for the operational models that businesses are running by now. And the level of complexity and uncertainty and ambiguity that leaders are expected to lead through in the modern context, they're simply not prepared or skilled enough to do that. And, that's no disrespect to those leaders. Organizations haven't invested in modern leadership development at scale for a very long time. Often, the 2-day course or maybe a couple of weeks here and there, dabbling in some relatively outdated leadership principles from the likes of GE and places like that where they were developed, means that leaders are just simply not equipped. So they haven't been doing a great job looking after their teams, which means that we're now that situation and manifested. I think all COVID did was amplify people's desire to talk about it because they had some time to go home and think about it. And whereas before potentially they were hamsters on a wheel, just relentlessly delivering, and then they would just leave their job because they burned out, take 6 months off or take a couple of weeks off or whatever they needed to recover and go and get the next job in the desperate hope that it was all going to fix itself, but it generally doesn't, and the pattern repeats itself. So I think, the key piece of research that we found was that this isn't necessarily down to a COVID thing. And so then you go, well, what can organizations and leaders, or what should organizations and leaders do about it? And it kind of comes down to, for me, to 5 core factors. The first one of which is around the idea of purpose. So what we see in many organizations is people are not aligned on why are we doing what we're doing, what is the outcome that we're looking for, what decisions are we making to make sure we stay on track with that. And we go down to if we use a sort of nautical metaphor or a boating metaphor, if we've got a rowboat and you've got everybody rowing in different directions as hard as they possibly can because they all believe that they're doing the right thing, then the boat's not going to go very fast, but there's a lot of energy being expended. And so the first of sort of the 5 ideas is, can you get people very, very clear on the purpose and the why and understanding where we're sailing the boat? And if you can, that tends to help. But it's amazing to me when you go into organizations and you say, so what's the purpose of this team, or what's the purpose of this organization? You get very different answers from every single person you ask, and they're all convinced they know the answer, but it's not the same. The second one is, I think by nature of the modern economic system, most people go to work, and certainly from our experience, most people are at work in some sort of fearful state. So fight or flight or freeze. And it comes down to, there's not enough budget. We're going to have to make some cuts. We're restructuring. KPI time is coming up. Annual performance reviews are coming up. There's a deadline looming. And people are like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And they're all in this like sort of cortisol adrenaline reaction. People can't perform at their best when they're scared, when they're worried, and when they're thinking, oh my God, am I going to lose my job? And the media does a really good job of kind of exacerbating this with the sort of what's the word, sort of scaremongering performance that they put through all of the articles around job losses and whatever. The reality is we're living in a more peaceful, abundant time than we've ever lived in probably in recorded history, but it feels worse, and we're being made to believe it's worse. So people are scared. I think organizations as well, because they're so busy, they struggle to connect people. So the third piece is around connection. And So whether that's a really comprehensive, let's get you on board, let's make you feel part of our tribe, let's connect you with a development plan, let's help you build networks. There's just no time for that fluffy stuff. So it's just like, hey, cool, you're here day one, crack on, there's your desk, get into it. And by the way, by the end of this week, I need a report on blah. Or by the end of this week, I need this deliverable. And we know that we're tribal animals and we need to connect and we need to have storytelling time and we need to have social activities and we need to have all these things. But again, by nature of the way we work now in many organizations, those moments, those key connection points have been eroded. It amazes me how many staff we talk to in organizations, even at relatively senior levels, who can't remember the last time they had a really meaningful one-to-one conversation with their boss. It's a key point of connection. So we see that happening. So leaders can do one-to-ones. That is going to change the game. 2 more to go, and then I'll pause. The fourth one is around the idea of exploration. And for me, as a leader, you almost want to inspire your team to try new things. It's, when if they were your children, you'd want them to play with new things and try new things and stumble and fall over. But in work, we're like, no, you can't try anything dangerous, because if it's risky, that's going to be your job on the line, or you could get fired for that. So as leaders, we want to encourage our staff to go experiment, controlled experiments, controlled risks. Communicate before you take the risk, so we can help you understand what the things you might not have realized are. So supported controlled risk taking, supported curiosity, innovation, lessons learned activities, all those things that help you drive innovation, versus high compliance cultures where you can't step out of the boundaries. Because what we see in burnout statistics is those people who are just hamsters on wheels tend to get burnout more frequently than those people who are trying and learning and growing and developing and picking up new skills and stumbling and having a debrief and then going back to what they were doing. And then the final piece is encouraging downtime. So there seems to be, and certainly in the North American businesses that we work with, there seems to be like a badge of honor for not taking vacation time. Like, I've got 50 days vacation stacked up, and either it's frowned on to take vacation, or it's a badge of honor to stack up your number higher than anybody else's. Not only is this a P&L risk for the organization to carry that annual leave quota, but what's that doing to your people? And we know in people's brains that essentially they need downtime to recharge. And this isn't about taking 2 weeks vacation. This is about going home on time. This is about not working evenings and weekends. This is about having hobbies and being able to connect with friends, debriefing and just watching movies and hanging out with the kids. Organizations are stealing that time away from people. And one of the big observations that we saw was when people started working from home, they gave their commute time to their business. They said, I used to get in the car at 7, drive for an hour, and then I get in the car at 5:30, drive for an hour. But now I don't have to do that. So I'll just log on at 7 and then I'll finish at 6:30. So we immediately gave our employees 2 extra hours a day, but that's also robbing us of that processing time while we're sat in the car or on the bus or on the train or whatever it was, to put all the things in our heads to rights. So as, again, leaders, we should be encouraging our people to take reflection time, to take time out, to take their vacations, to take evenings and to take weekends. And actively watching and managing that, because people feel busy, people feel obliged to perform. The very, very final sort of summary of all that is leaders need to be more aware and more skilled and more equipped with the framework or the thinking framework for how do I look out for burnout and how do I solve it?
Yeah, and I think thank you for that. It's really sort of valuable insights, and I resonate with all of those 5 points you've made. And what it seems to me, if I just summarize it, is treating people as people, which sounds really basic, really obvious, and recognizing that people are human beings and not human doings, and allowing that sense of, the purpose piece is, it's not just a nice mission statement to have on the wall, but actually is something to get people excited. It might not align specifically, everybody be aligned to it, but actually recognize that people do have purpose as well. And if you can harmonize a little bit of that to your purpose, it starts to resonate and people get excited and give energy for it. It becomes not like work, and like you just said before, what you do right now because you're doing it on purpose, it doesn't feel like work. And I'm sure you still watch out in terms of giving yourself downtime and all that, but what you're actually doing you love it. It's excited and it's not a drain on you. It gives you energy in a sense. And I think going back to that connection piece where you talked about the sort of one-to-ones, I've had probably in the last couple of months lots of client conversations with leaders where, frankly, I'm quite shocked how poor and how badly one-to-ones are either not happening, or there's when I asked clients about one-to-ones, I said, what's the purpose of it? And they thought, I don't know. And it just feels like a tick box, and they've lost the meaning of what a one-to-one's about and that connection piece. And so I think it's just
more often than not, a one-to-one is a whip meeting, right? What are you working on? And here's some more work for you. Versus to get back to your point, the person, not the position. A one-to-one should be a check-in with that person. How are you doing? What's going on for you? And all the other stuff will fall into the place.
And I think it's allowing people to be a bit more and to be more in the moment and be more in that sense of just being sort of in the moment with what they're doing, rather than trying to think about the next thing and racing ahead and missing actually those moments with each other and building those connections. What do you think gets in the way? We know this, and there's lots of research out there, and you and I work with organizations in different ways, probably achieving the same thing ultimately at the end game. What gets in the way of organizations going, yes, this is what we're going to do, we're going to have to go and do it? What's the big thing you think that stops them building on? Because when they do this, they get engaged staff who are refreshed, and there's evidence. We know there's evidence. Like I know that if you develop a purpose-led organization, your profits go up significantly versus a non-purpose driven. There's data. There's actual real data over 10 years. I've seen it. So what gets in the way? Why don't we believe it? Because we don't seem to be investing in our people in this way.
Yeah, it's something that's been playing on my mind for a while. So I had our research team go and find out. And there's a couple of things. Number one, I alluded to earlier, is the educational models that we put our leaders through are either limited, i.e. not available to everybody, and therefore people are just doing their best with the tools they have. And many of the leadership programs that are taught are outdated. So if we look at the business construct for most organizations, still the focus is on shareholder return, productivity, performance, output, optimization, efficiencies, cost cutting, very good industrial revolution style measures and metrics, and were fantastic for a time. You then overlay the challenges that we've had globally for the last few years, things like COVID, where people suddenly the way that they managed was by talking to people and connecting with them, but suddenly those people were not available to them. So the communication levels dropped by, I think it was somewhere between 72 and 73% of the average communication moved from a verbal to an email communication within teams. So it used to be, I would say, hey, Julian, what do you think about this? And you would go, oh, that's a ridiculous idea. But instead I had to now send an email or an MSN chat and wait. And so that communication just dropped significantly. Some fantastic research that came out of NASA, a guy called Paul Allen, who talked about the efficiency and innovation levels based on proximity. And if you're within 4 feet of somebody, proximity innovation goes up by about 75%. So that proximity was reduced, and that caused some real challenges. I think another challenge is, so we've got our ill-equipped leaders, ill-trained leaders, and we've got the proximity thing, lack of communication. The third one that really seems to be an issue is we don't teach prioritization. Because everybody's so scared to say no, because they're in fear of job cuts, restructures, not getting the bonus, not getting the promotion, not being seen as the high performer, nobody says no. And so over time, we've got all these old things that we used to do that were priorities, and then we just add another priority and we add another priority. And it's very, very rare when we go into organizations that we've got an executive team or a senior leadership team that goes, right, we're going to stop doing half of this stuff. And one of the activities we do in organizations, if we do the prioritization activity based on what's the purpose of this, and we end up with 3 columns essentially on the flip chart, which is we've not really got any idea of the purpose of this, but somebody told us we had to do it, so we keep doing it. We kind of see the purpose of this, but it's a wishy-washy one, and we're just doing it because it needs to be done, and we're very, very clear on the purpose and why we're doing this. And we go through that activity and we go, so things that we don't really know the purpose of and we just do them because somebody told us to do them, we should just stop doing all those, right? And people are like, yes, but that one we probably need to move, and this one needs to stay, and then we can't stop doing that one because so and so says that we need it. And I go, right, well, so why don't we go and have some conversations about those things, and why don't we stop doing those things? But the reality is that people have just got more and more and more and more on their plates, and they've also got a whole lot more complexity in their personal lives going on. So maybe they've now got more complex caregiving relationships. Maybe they're working from home, so trying to manage diaries with their partners and their kids, and there's a whole lot more complexity. So their mental energy is also being spent on that whilst they're trying to deal with these overwhelming number of priorities. And so that's causing a lot of this noise, I think, is that there's just too much going on. We're trying to do too many things at the same time, and we haven't got the confidence to say, no, let's stop doing some of those things for fear of being found out or lost. I'm not sure.
I think we need to be a bit more like children, where, you ask a child to do something, and my children are a great example, and they go, why? And I know we sometimes, as an adult, you say, well, just do it because I'm just telling you to do it. But actually, asking some whys behind why you asked me to do that, so I can understand them in a respectful, kind way. It doesn't have to be aggressive, it doesn't have to be confrontational. What contribution is that making towards our purpose? What contribution is that making towards our thing? And I think almost asking those whys behind it. And I think that's a great exercise you just explained there about, what's aligned to our purpose and what isn't, and using that as a way of discarding those things that are not a priority, because everything's a priority in sometimes in some organizations. Interestingly, I used to work at Johnson & Johnson, and they used to have I think they still have a credo, and it's all about, and the priority is their employees are first. It's an upside down credo, basically. So employees, and then it was customers, stakeholders, and then profits. And so their priority was their staff, and they were very people orientated, very people centric, and yet they still make good money, hit the stock market and everything else, still perform really well. And I think organizations need to get a little bit more focused on the people. And that's very cliche, invest in your people and it will come. It really does. It's a longer term thing. It's more sustainable, and it's more beneficial for everybody, in not just in your organization, but the communities you work in and interact with, and your suppliers and your customers. Just finally, Ria, I'd like to just get your thoughts on, if you're a leader in an organization and you're spotting, what things should we look out for in staff to think, actually, I think they're at a point of on the edge, so to speak, and what signs should we be looking at, and how can we engage with them, and how can we try and support those?
Yeah, this is another fascinating question, and often people are going to rely on things like their engagement survey results to tell them how are our staff feeling. And from experience working in a number of organizations, the engagement survey often has a pretty low response rate. That's indicative in itself. And even if the response rate is high, that data cannot be looked at a macro level. You can't go, organizationally, we're good, so we're fine. There will be pockets of high engagement and pockets of low engagement. And you need to understand, are there any patterns in those pockets, and what's going on in those pockets of disengagement that are causing a real struggle? It's about going into the data in detail at a senior leadership level and going, well, where are we struggling and where are we good, and why, in terms of what's happening with that leader versus that leader, for example. But then you also need to look at that data in alignment with other pieces of data. So the ones we recommend are things like turnover. So staff turnover, how fast are people leaving your business? What percentage of your business is leaving each year? How long are people staying after they were recruited? There's a couple of industries I've got experience in where under 25s are lasting less than 6 months in that industry. And so there's a real challenge, right? For what they thought they were buying and what they actually got when they turned up to work was a very different thing. Looking at your health and safety incidents. So are we seeing more accidents, more sick days? Are we seeing people reaching out to EAP? So our EAP referrals, our employee assistance program referrals, are they going up? Starting to look at disciplinary incidents. So are we having more fights at work? Are we having people talking back to their boss because they're literally at their wit's end? Are we having people having massive arguments in corridors? When you start to look at, when you sort of zoom out and start to look at various different pieces of data and assimilate those together and look at the pattern and the vibe, that's where you start to really get a true picture of what's going on in the organization, not just relying on a single point of aggregated engagement survey data, which tells you an aggregated average story. And we all know what happens when you sort of average something, you lose all the granularity.
That's really helpful. And I think it's good to have that perspective of, that one-on-one, what you're observing in a person, but also thinking on a broader team or even organization point of view, what are those issues of, health and safety, other dynamics that may be happening actually to look out for.
We could probably zoom in a little bit as well. If we zoom into, if I'm a leader of a team, what am I going to look for in my team? Maybe we just go for that for more tactical examples. People who used to be good performers who aren't, people who are complaining more, people who've gone quiet, people who are turning up to work late or leaving early, people who you've given them something to do and they kind of just look lost or grey when, they're dead behind the eyes. That can be quite often one. People who are traditionally were more social, have stopped being social, people who are working from home more than they're in the office and don't want to come to team events or office events. Again, little tactical indicators. If you're the leader of a team and you go, I'm just watching that person, they used to be like this and now they're like that, then there's some indicators you might want to have a conversation.
Yeah, I always say to leaders, our coaches, look for patterns, look for like 2 or 3 things they keep doing differently or the same. That's the pattern you're after. And once you see a pattern, then investigate it, understand it, find what's going on, engage with them, talk to them, and try and find out that. It's been great talking to you today, Jimmy. We could talk a lot more about this. I know you've got a whole ton of experience and insight as well. If people want to connect with you and get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Probably the best way is just through LinkedIn, Jimmy Burroughes on LinkedIn. You can also find me on my website, jimmyburroughes.com. And I'm very happy to have a conversation with anybody. And if anybody wants to listen to more experts and global thinkers like yourself, who are great podcast guests, and each week we try and talk to a guest from a different angle around how to achieve high performance, then tune into the Ways of Working podcast.
Brilliant. And we'll put a link in the show notes for that. Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today, Jimmy.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.